Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing Jessica Brody's book, Save the Cat Writes a Novel. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into an overview of what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. I did listen to this on audiobook with Jessica Brody herself reading it, so unfortunately I don't have a cover to share with you this week. This book is a little bit complicated to get into, but I'll talk very briefly about Jessica Brody, then get back to what the book is. Jessica Brody is an author of mostly YA teen as well as tween fiction. She's still probably best known for this book, Save the Cat Writes a Novel, and she has a sequel coming, or kind of an ancillary product called Save the Cat Writes a YA Novel that I believe was released earlier this year. This book, the one that I'm reviewing, is the one that came out in 2018, and it's called Save the Cat Writes a Novel. So this book, Save the Cat Writes a Novel, takes a lot of its information and cues from the 2005 book by Blake Snyder called Save the Cat. Save the Cat, the original Blake Snyder book, came out in 2005 and is mostly revolves around screenwriting. And in a similar way, that book looked at different beats, is the Blake Snyder term for it, but story moments that you see kind of repeated in different genres across, in that book, cinema history, and basically breaks down how these beats can be used in order to, in that case, write a screenplay. Blake Snyder tragically passed away a few years ago, and this book takes a lot of that information and applies it specifically to writing novels. And so instead of the beats being applied to screenwriting, it's applied to novels. She has done a very good job of using contemporary examples. Here, I think she does a good job of taking those beats and tweaking them for novels slightly. So an instance of a beat, in case anybody's kind of confused. So there's a moment that comes in a lot of novels, which we call the all is lost moment. So that's the point in the novel where the hero or heroes are feeling defeated, and there's a kind of a dark night of the soul of what is going to happen. Is this character going to give up, or is this character going to keep going and eventually find some reserved strength to move forward? So this is a kind of a moment that you see repeatedly in really all fiction, and it's an example of a beat that she talks about here. But what this is basically her system of writing novels by using these beats that Blake Snyder has created, which are in some ways based on Campbellian monomyth. So if you've seen my review for the writer's journey, which I'll leave a link below if you haven't seen it, that and the beat sheet are very similar. But specifically for this book, I like how she has, I think, kind of remixed the material for, I think, a little bit of a more contemporary, a little bit of a younger audience. And I think that part of it is good. I think the tone is very supportive and breezy. She has some concepts that she kind of articulates very well. You know, she says every novel should have an A story and a B story, an A story being kind of the surface or plot of the story, and the B story being something that's really internal to your main character. She talks about using that beat sheet that I mentioned earlier as a map in order to figure out where in your story you are. She has a really good section on log lines and how to create a log line and a short synopsis for your book. I thought that was well done. And then the story genres, I think, is probably where the best part of this book is, where she basically goes through and says, you know, your book will probably fall into one of these 10 genres. It could be anything from what she calls a dude with a problem to a superhero story to a monster in a house. So these are not specifically going to be the same genres that you see maybe in your Barnes & Noble. For instance, she would categorize Harry Potter as a superhero story because the main character, Harry Potter, is a character who is kind of a blessed character who is destined for greatness. And so she gives several examples in each of these genres, but at the end of each chapter, she takes a very famous example from the genre. So Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone, Joe Hill's Heart-Shaped Box. I think she uses Ready Player One as well. But she takes them and basically shows you how the beat sheet that Blake Snyder created, that she has kind of remixed a little bit, applies to each one of these stories. And so I thought that was really cool. I fast forwarded, just for disclosure, if it was something like The Help or something like The Kite Runner that I have not read, I fast forwarded through those sections at the end of the chapters because I didn't want to be spoiled in case I do read those in the future. But for everything I did read, and she does have a lot of examples of stuff that you have read here. I thought that was really, really instructive to see different ways that you can use these things in different genres, and how the genre will ultimately help you determine what your story is and how to place your characters in it. I thought that was well done. I think the idea that she has, the main idea, I would say, is focusing on a main character and understanding where your main character fits in. I think she has a similar problem to plot and structure in that there's talks about secondary characters, and she has questions of how to know your character is the main character, how to know that a secondary characters. I don't know if that ever fully gets resolved, but that is kind of the way that she puts forward, is to say, who is your main character and what is the arc of your main character, and that should help you determine kind of the A story and the B story of your book. Some things that I had a harder time with, I think there's a couple places where there's profanity used, which isn't really, to me, the end of the world, but if I was giving this to a young person, I would maybe take pause there. Maybe this is cleaned up in the YA book that she's releasing, but it just was only at one or two places, but it just was like, I think it's not necessary, and I think it could have applied to the book, would have had a broader appeal if there wasn't some profanity in it. Not a huge deal, but it took me out of it a little bit to be like, oh, well, I wish you hadn't cursed there for really no reason. I thought that the book is like Blake Snyder's book, and you'll hear the criticism there as well. The book is very prescriptive, and what do I mean by that? It means that it looks at page count and things of that nature. In the Blake Snyder, it would be looking at page count as far as the script pages, but here they're looking at page counts or as percentages of the manuscript of where these things should happen in your story. So, for instance, the opening image should happen, I don't know if it's 1 to 5%, somewhere in your opening pages, you should have the what they call the opening image. And so my only issue with that is I do think it is, if you're giving someone who's writing for the first time, it can cause them to lock up and second guess themselves. If you, again, take this as written, like you should do this thing, this is the way that you should do it. And I think that may be blocking for some people. Some people may really enjoy that and having that, okay, this is where this goes, this is where this goes, this is where this goes. To me, it's a little bit, when you get down to that level of granularity to where it has to be between pages 40 and 65, to me, it does take a little bit of the magic of the ability for you to go and talk about other things and do other things in your book while still having, hitting these points, but having the freedom to do other things. And it's a little bit, to me, I would err on the side of you having the ability to do whatever you want with your book and not being so caught up on what page the Dark Night of the Soul is. That's the way I feel about it. Other people may feel differently, and I understand that. She has a frequently asked questions section that I think left me a little cold. I don't think it was as detailed as it maybe could have been, and it is a relatively short part of the book. And then she doesn't really mention prologues. She does mention that your main character should have the first chapter in the book, and they should be, again, the focus of the story, and they should have the first chapter so you know that they're the main character. And even some of the books that she mentioned, like Game of Thrones, oftentimes has main characters who are not in the prologue, who are not long for this world, but the prologue is used for, in that series of books, the prologue is usually used for setting the tone or giving one-off characters to give you information that the author really couldn't give you information any way easier than the way that he's doing it, or to give you kind of a recap of where we are. And so she doesn't really mention prologues and how maybe there may be tension between having a prologue without a main character and if you should use prologues. She doesn't really mention prologues in the book, but I think a prologue can be a way for you to set the tone of your world, or to give someone an interesting backstory of your world without maybe tying that to the main character necessarily. And so, for another example was The Collapsing Empire by John Scalzi, which is a book I read a few months ago. I'll leave that review later below. That was a book that had a prologue that had nothing to do with the rest of the story in terms of the characters in it. But it also gave you a tone of the world, gave you some history of the world, gave you kind of the rules of the world. But it did it in a very fast, breezy way, and then you were on to the main character. Now, my issues with that book are not really from the prologue, other than I don't think the rest of the book held up to the prologue, but it was strange to me, or surprising to me, that there are a lot of books that do have prologues, and she doesn't really mention the prologue as being something that's, something to think about or consider. If I was, again, reading this as this is the way that you should do things. You would not have prologues because you would just jump into the life of your main character. I'm saying there are times where that may be ineffective, or there may be times where that's limiting to the author. So overall, I did enjoy it. I think if you were giving someone this book, I would personally, if someone said, where should someone read this, I would actually probably not. And to Jessica Brody's credit, she says there are times where she uses the beats and whatnot, but she uses it after she writes her first draft or discovery draft. There's times when she's talking about in the frequently asked questions how she gets started. She basically says, I think there's 5 that are kind of tentpole beats that she knows before she writes her story. But then she goes back later and deals with the rest of them. And I thought that was interesting. I think for me, if I was giving this to a young author, I would probably not give this to them to read until after they've maybe written the discovery draft, unless they were really super stuck. Just because I think you can get caught up on the prescription a little bit too much, because it's there throughout the book. I think the information is useful. I think the genre stuff is actually the best part of it, of kind of seeing where these different genres are and how these beats can be used in different genres to different effect. I thought that was really cool. Do you need to read this or buy this book if you are familiar with the Blake Snyder? I think there's enough of the Blake Snyder, that book, if you know that book like ins and outs, unless you specifically like to see more contemporary examples of stuff. I don't know how much different the information there is. She does change a few things here and there, but I think the information is largely the same. It's been a long time since I've read the Blake Snyder stuff, so if I'm wrong and you've read both recently, please let me know below to correct that. But when I was reading this, and she basically says, the first act should be one way, and the point of the second act is to bring in new characters and to give you a reversal of the first act. And the only thing that was running through my head that entire time was The Lion King, because that's what the Lion King is. And I mean, really, if you think about it, you have the Pride Rock stuff, and then you have Hakuna Matata, and then you have the third act, which is a synthesis of the first 2 acts. So that is all just to say, if you're familiar with the Blake Snyder thing, if you're familiar with the 3-act structure, to me, this book is more geared towards maybe beginners and people who are really not quite sure like what genre their book falls in, and wants to see different ways that they could structure a book in terms of these different things, and thinking about what is your main character, who is your main character, thinking about the flaws of your character. I thought that section was really good. Overall, those are my feelings on it. I think it was worth a read if you're someone who is maybe just getting into writing and wants some kind of structure, but don't want some kind of very something like a Snowflake Method. You want something that's fairly tried and true, and here are the things you must do point by point by point. Then you may enjoy this. And for people who are like, I'm just going to write whatever I write, and then maybe come back later and see where those things fall in, and then write a second draft, that actually also may be something that's useful for you. So that is Jessica Brody's Save the Cat Writes a Novel. Next time I will be reading Andy Weir's Project Artemis. Till next time, if you could, like the video, subscribe to the channel. Till next time, bye.